The Gospels give you roughly 3 years of Jesus' public ministry in detail: sermons, arguments, miracles, the final week, practically hour by hour. Then there's the rest of his life: birth, one incident at age 12, and then nothing until he shows up at the Jordan River around age 30. 18 years, roughly 90% of his entire life on earth. And Scripture covers it in exactly one sentence. That sentence is Luke 2, verse 52. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. That's it. That's the entire recorded content of his adolescence and 20s. Compare that to the final week of his life, which gets 4 separate detailed accounts. The imbalance is so extreme that people have spent 2,000 years trying to fill it in, with theories ranging from careful historical reconstruction to outright fabrication. Start with what the text actually gives you, because it's more than people assume. Mark 6, verse 3, has the people of Nazareth asking, "Is not this the carpenter?" The Greek word is tekton, which means something closer to builder or craftsman than the narrow English word carpenter, someone who worked wood, stone, and probably basic construction. That's Joseph's trade, and the assumption, never stated outright, but implied by the culture, is that Jesus learned it from him, the way sons did. Here's what most retellings skip past. In a first-century Jewish household, a boy wasn't just raised, he was trained, memorizing Scripture from early childhood, apprenticed into a trade by his early teens. Nazareth was a small, unremarkable village, maybe a few hundred people, close enough to the Roman-influenced city of Sepphoris that day labor there was plausible. Whatever those 18 years looked like, they almost certainly looked like everyone else's 18 years in that specific time and place. Ordinary is the historically responsible guess, not a mysterious blank. That hasn't stopped people from filling the blank anyway. The most famous fabrication came from a Russian journalist named Nicholas Notovich, who published a book in 1894 claiming he'd found an ancient manuscript in a Himalayan monastery describing Jesus traveling to India and Tibet during these years, studying under Hindu and Buddhist teachers. The theory still circulates. It was discredited within years of publication. The monastery in question stated no such manuscript existed, and no serious historian treats the claim as anything but a fabrication built to sell books. A second legend sends Jesus to Egypt during this same period, sometimes merging with the actual, textually supported infancy flight to Egypt in Matthew 2, which happened when he was a small child fleeing Herod, not a young man studying abroad. A third legend, considerably more local, claims a teenage Jesus traveled to Britain with Joseph of Arimathea, tied to trade routes in Cornish tin. The same legend behind William Blake's poem asking whether those feet in ancient time walked upon England's mountains green. Blake wasn't claiming history, he was writing poetry. Later readers took the metaphor literally. Pay attention to what all 3 of these legends have in common. None of them appear in any source within centuries of Jesus's actual lifetime. The India theory surfaces in the 1890s. The Britain legend's earliest traceable form is medieval, over 1,000 years removed. These aren't suppressed historical records. They're stories invented long after the fact to answer a question the original sources simply didn't think needed answering. Here's the detail worth sitting with. The writers closest to the actual events didn't feel the gap needed filling at all. Mark, widely considered the earliest gospel, skips the birth entirely and opens with the adult ministry. Luke, who clearly had access to birth narratives and cared enough to include the temple incident at age 12, still jumps straight from that one scene to 30 years old with a single summary sentence. If the silence were an embarrassment to cover up, the easiest move would have been inventing something. Nobody did. Contrast that restraint with what actually happened later, outside the accepted texts. A work called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, written probably in the 2nd century, does try to fill the gap, with a child, Jesus, striking a playmate dead for bumping into him, then reviving him, and molding clay sparrows that fly away. The Church never accepted this text as scripture, precisely because these stories read as exactly what they are: invented miracle stories with no restraint, nothing like the sober, understated tone of the accepted Gospels. The silence in Luke and Mark isn't a gap despite the writer's storytelling instincts. It's a gap because of them. Stay with the one scene we do have inside the gap, because it's the only window anyone gets. Luke 2, verses 41 through 52, a 12-year-old Jesus stays behind in the Jerusalem temple after Passover, found 3 days later sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions, his answers startling everyone present. Then the text says plainly, he went back to Nazareth with his parents and was obedient to them. One flash of something unusual, followed immediately by 18 more years of ordinary domestic life. The pattern repeats: a glimpse, then silence, then obedience. The detail about his family life during this stretch is easy to miss. Mark 6 names 4 brothers: James, Joseph, Judas, Simon, and mentions unnamed sisters, all apparently still at home in Nazareth when Jesus begins his ministry. Whatever the 18 years held, they held ordinary family structure: parents, siblings, a household. Almost certainly, Joseph's death at some point before the ministry begins, since he disappears from the narrative entirely by that point without explanation. From a historical methods standpoint, this kind of gap isn't actually unusual for ancient biographical writing. Detailed records survive disproportionately for kings, generals, and events tied to empires and wars. An ordinary tradesman's son in an unremarkable Galilean village doing unremarkable things is exactly the kind of person antiquity simply didn't document. Not because something was hidden, but because nothing about the surface of those years registered as historically noteworthy to anyone alive at the time. Augustine, writing centuries later, treated the silence itself as theologically load-bearing rather than a problem needing a solution. That God become fully human meant living an actual, unremarkable human life, not skipping straight to a public performance of divinity. A hidden, ordinary adolescence isn't a hole in the story. For that reading, it's the specific claim the story is making: full humanity, including all the boring years nobody bothers to write down. So the honest answer to 18 missing years isn't India, isn't Britain, isn't a secret education from Hindu monks. It's a small house in a small village, a trade learned from a father who then vanishes from the record, siblings growing up around him, and one Passover trip where something briefly showed through before 18 more years of ordinary obedience closed back over it. Which theory did you hear growing up? India, Britain, or something else entirely? Tell me where you first heard it. This is the first video in a series following Jesus' life in order, birth to ascension, The next one picks up exactly where the silence breaks, at the Jordan River.